Hello, this is Taylor Ellwood with Magical Experiments, and today I am excited to have on my podcast Maria Miles, who is an alchemist and an astrologer. And Maria, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you and where we can find you on the web?
Awesome. It's really great to be here. I'm Maria. I am an astrologer. I that is my foremost hat, I guess I wear, the preferred one. Um, and if anybody were to be interested in me, they could find me at rootedstars.astrology.com. Um, so I got started with astrology as probably like I think around 10 or 11 is when I first got like this little kid's book on sun signs, and I was like, ooh, cool, I'm a Libra. um, but
I'm
it
a
was around
Libra too.
six. Yeah, I didn't know that. Cool. Um, Great. We both have depressed suns. That's awesome.
Yeah, really, right?
um, I always think it's so funny. People are always like, "Oh, Libras are so creative and sociable," and I'm like, "Yeah, it's because our suns are so degenerated by that random happenstance of birth that we kind of have to reach out to others."
I'm a Libra moon too, on top of it. So I got a
Oh,
whole bunch of Libra. I have a whole bunch of Libra in my chart. So.
yeah, a new moon baby, huh?
Oh yeah.
Um, um, but I started studying astrology a bit more closer and like looking at charts around age 16. That's like when I began getting more into, like pop astrology, more modern psychological astrology. My teenage years were kind of where a lot of my interests and all of this stuff began. I think that's probably true of a lot of occultists. But I presently practice what is called traditional astrology, which is getting, I think, more popular, especially as people are wanting to dig deeper into things and find some actual substance past all the memes that are shared on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter that, make people laugh, might be kind of funny, but, the actual meat of it lies in, what you can do with it. And I started studying traditional astrology around age 22. I'm turning 30 this year, so
Okay.
just to give a little bit of a time span. Now with alchemy, it also was something I was introduced to in my teenage years, but of course I didn't get into actual lab alchemy until just the past couple of years. But that was the age where I was volunteering at a used bookstore, and I got multiple copies of A.E. Waite's various books. I got the book on ceremonial magic, so that's where I got introduced to grimoires. I got a copy of his the complete like works of Paracelsus, and I think that was kind of also probably the very first introduction to astrology I had, or not astrology, alchemy. And of course, also that's very obtuse for like a teenager to be looking into the massive symbolism, and then also just very technical jargon you would not understand without having a little bit of a modern guiding post, which is thankfully something I found in the works of Robert Bartlett and his teacher, Frater Albertus. Which I also found around age 22. So 22 is kind of like the time where I really began also discovering like the local occult community here in Washington, particularly in Seattle. That was around the time when the esoteric book conferences were happening, and that was a gateway to me meeting a lot of people and a lot of very close friends who I still have good connections with. And yeah, I mean, I think like a lot of people, I kind of just dove in one day because really no easy way of getting into all of this stuff, right?
No, there isn't. You and I might have actually met because I actually vended at the Esoteric Book Conference a few times. So
that's possible. Were you there like 2014?
yeah.
Okay, okay. It is possible. I looked very different then, so you probably wouldn't recognize me. But that
We
was,
all probably looked a bit different then.
yeah. um, God, I can't remember if that was the year where the there was this excellent talk about the Cyprianic black books from Sweden, and the guy who's doing the talk just begins going on some sort of thing where he's like, and Satan, and then a giant thunder clap happened, like really loud one, which is rare for here. So it was really, really funny. That's always been one of those moments that are captured from that for me. Um, yeah, and that was, I think, a lot of this time between about age 16 and age 22 is when I think I really just began accumulating lots and lots of books, um, which is sort of the only way to get into, what we could call like Western esotericism, because there really aren't living traditions, barring maybe a couple things you could argue are, but the books were my main introduction to all of this. Lots of reading.
No, I mean, I would agree with that. I mean, my own approach to magic, and I started practicing when I was 16 years old, my gateway was books. I mean, I started reading books, and granted, I mean, there are different living traditions out there. There are also, there are also people who've created traditions, or at least they're creating systems of magic that they hope will become traditions.
Yeah.
I think there is a very important distinction between a system and a tradition, but that's a different topic altogether. But
True.
it's true. I mean, a lot of people go out there and they learn through books. Do you remember like what the first books were that you read? You still have them?
Yeah, I do. I don't have access to them because they're buried in my garage somewhere. I have a massive collection of books. I've been collecting all sorts of books since I was a teenager. The earliest books, like I said, one of them, like I said, was A.E. Waite's book on ceremonial magic. So that was the first time I was exposed to like the Keys of Solomon and Ars Goetia, Grimorium Verum, all of those. Some of the other really early ones, which are from a bit younger, because magic's a little bit different. I was fascinated with the idea of magic since around age 10 or 11. Also was obsessed with the idea of learning how to make potions, which I think is really funny that I've gotten into alchemy now, because it kind of feeds my inner child a little bit to, be making these strange decoctions and then burning things down to a nice ash to produce salts and stuff. It's very fun and very fun activities, honestly. And to be truthful, how I presently am exploring alchemy is much more of just through a spagyric lens. I do a lot of what I think my teacher would call guerrilla alchemy. Like I don't right now have like a sock slit extractor or a distillation train really of any kind. I just kind of stick herbs in Everclear and leave them in a dark closet and shake them every day at the right planetary hour for the plant. I will go on tangents. I'll have to catch myself. Some of the other books, original books I think I had so some of them were like DJ Conway's books as well.
Sure.
The Occult of Personality podcast was a way that I got exposed to a number of authors. Too. I didn't glom onto everything I got from there, but I think that was actually how I found out about the book conference too.
And see, that's interesting to me because I mean, like I'll just say that I'm about 15 years older than you. So, of course, my way of learning about it really was, there were no podcasts when I was a teenager or anything like that. So it's just kind of an interesting generational thing to see that as a difference and to see how magic has become more accessible as a result. I think that it's always fascinating.
That is true. Oh, also the work of not Robert Bartlett. Oh gosh, R.A.W. Why can't I remember his last name?
Robert Anton Wilson?
Yes, that was Prometheus Rising was a quintessential book in my teenage years that I think really got me into magical thinking, and helping me kind of re-enchant my own world. Although I don't know if my world was ever de-enchanted, maybe except for a small blip there. As a child, it was always something, I was very firmly set in, no, there are strange magical things out there. People just don't know how to look at them. and as much as my family at certain points tried to stamp that out because they're scared of that sort of thing, it survived, and I'm still doing.
That's and that's a good thing. So
Mhm.
I'm curious about something you'd mentioned in your biography a little bit that you gave me and stuff, that you've linked your astrology to the alchemical works. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like how has your study of astrology fed into alchemy? And I will say there's a book that I read called Gold of a Thousand Mornings. It's by
Hmm.
Antonin Artaud. It's an alchemy book basically about do work, where he
Hmm.
talks about astrology and alchemy a fair amount. So I thought, when you mentioned that, it perked my interest. So like how has your study of astrology fed into alchemy, and how do they relate to each other?
Well, they're both important pillars in what we'd call the Hermetic arts, right? Um, Astrology kind of provides the background of everything within the span of what we'd call Hermeticism, because it's the schema by which the cosmos rules itself. And that if we want to understand anything, we have to understand how it works, right? When people take a materialist scientific approach, it's not all that different. We're trying to understand why the world is the way it is. And astrology is kind of the way to understand that if you're going to be doing magic or alchemy. Um, for instance, ways that they intersect, I mean, I try very hard to time my workings with the moon, because the movements of the moon, and not just the moon sign and things like that, because the signs also are attributed to specific workings in alchemy, but the seasons of the moon, which is something that I feel like people are going to talk more about, because it's something I feel like that we're rediscovering through especially lots of the new modern translations of the Persian-Arabic astrologers like Abu Mashar and Salman Bishr. Um, but this notion that the moon is a second sun in many ways, and she has her own seasons as she goes through her cyanotic cycles. So I will try to time like recombinations and cohobations with the new moon, or just starting new macerations. When it comes to starting a new spagyric process, I'll try to time it to the new moon. Um, Doing extractions when the moon is waxing and crescent, and each phase of the moon is associated with a season. So from new moon to first quarter is the spring. From first quarter to full is the summer. From full to second quarter is the autumn. And from second quarter until the new moon is the winter. And so you can time what you're doing alchemically, whether that's like I said, starting a new project, or uniting two things together, separating things, calcinating things, crystallizing, sublimating, all the various lots of words and blah 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 type stuff. You can time all of that if you're clever. Uh, Now, my teacher is kind of fun. It's kind of funny because we went over all of this in the courses that he does, but he also likes to say that he's not a slave to astrology. Like, he will just do the work when it needs to be done, and that is also true. But there is a great strength when you're kind of uniting the three worlds into what you're doing. Um, Using symbols as well, like in your lab setting. I know a lot of people will use the Kameas, the planetary squares, as a kind of a backdrop for their tinctures when they're making them, or other alchemical products. Um, I myself right now, while I've been studying it for, 6 or 7 years, I've only recently started doing the lab work. So I'm still kind of a baby when it comes to it. But another way that astrologically another way that I include astrology with my alchemy, or rather alchemy with my astrology, is I actually decide what sort of herbs I take and what sort of tinctures to make and use based on my natal chart. This is something you can kind of find in the work of Culpeper. And where he talks about making medicines based on a person's birth chart. So you look for herbs and medicines that will strengthen the Lord of the Ascendant and the sect light. And you also look at what is, antithetical to the Lord of the sixth house, which is the Lord of, which is the house of sickness, and things like that. So I also am, and you have to tread lightly with this stuff when you don't have a certification in something like, say, like as an herbalist, like, or a medical degree. So you have to be very careful. For instance, if I ever recommend something to a client, it's never in the context of, oh, this will heal you. It's more of a, this might be something nice to try. I try to use vague language about it, such as, oh, try a solary herb if a person is rather afflicted by something that's Saturnine, for instance, or Venusian if someone is afflicted by a martial sort of issue, and so on, sort of things like that. That kind of opposite treatment thing that comes from Galenic medicine, where you treat diseases with the opposite of their qualities, is the sort of baseline thing I go with. But again, I never try to phrase it or think of it in terms of diagnosing or curing anything, because that's how you get hit with, fraud cases if you're not careful.
Well, and I think too, it's always important to encourage people to use all the available resources to them. Use the medical resources. Use
Yes.
any of those other things. Like there's certainly nothing wrong with exploring alternative approaches toward health. I certainly have done that myself, but I think having that balance and recognizing where all of these things can work together can be useful. Like, let's use all of our resources. Don't just use one thing and hope that it'll take care of your problem, when it might help a bit, but there may be other things that you need to attend to as well.
Precisely. That is precisely it, I think. Hammer, meet, nail. And that's kind of the approach overall I want to be able to take, and that I'm trying to build for myself, because my practice as a witch or a magical person, however you want to call it, has changed off and on. There are certain core things that haven't. For instance, prayer has always been a major cornerstone of my work, and that's something I start off with at the beginning of every alchemical working, is praying over what I'm doing, asking for success, asking for it to reveal itself to me, what its uses are, and yeah, certainly using everything at my disposal, because that's the other thing too, is I work a lot with what I guess people would call stellar image magic or astrological magic, the making of talismans. I try to make talismans, and not everybody will agree with me on this, but of course, astrologers and magicians, I don't think very often agree with each other on much. So I am not too worried about that. But I do think there is something to making talismans that aspect your natal chart with a good synastry sort of relationship. Choosing planets that are beneficial to you based on your birth chart, for instance, I think is a very good idea in general. I had a time early on where I was making lots of Mars talismans for some reason. I don't really know why. I think I just kind of like, oh, Mars is the easiest to work with right now. And I've buried many of those somewhere far away, so I don't have to deal with them anymore. But it's like you can't imbalance things if you're not working too carefully. But for instance, like I have this ring on my hand right here that is a magical ring that I made using the instructions from Agrippa, and it was this was a project I worked with Tony Mack, who is a really great gold and silversmith, and so he cast the metal for this ring at the same moment that I was etching the barrel. In the setting, I was etching it with the sigil of the fixed star Sirius at the same moment that he was casting the metals. So that was a great project, and something I've been really happy with. And I tend to wear it whenever I'm Doing stuff like this, talking with people, or as well as when I am working with clients. So if I'm doing astrology or if I'm doing card readings, I guess I didn't mention that either, because it doesn't quite fit into my little niche hermetic sort of approach I taking now, I guess. But card reading has been something that I've done since I was 13, and I've been taking clients for it a lot longer than I've been taking astrological clients. And yeah, just sort of trying to find the most beneficial things. And like I said, a holistic approach is what I'm kind of looking for. I'm trying to find a way of supporting myself spiritually in a really organic but methodical way that doesn't work against me, because that's something that's very easy to do if you're not really aware of things astrologically, like in your birth chart especially, which is why it's important.
I was going to actually ask you like how you work with the astrological currents, like for example, or cycles. Like for example, I recently bought my house and
Mhm.
I timed it just right so that it occurred during a Saturn cycle, which was
Mm,
perfect for buying the house. Like I talked to
yeah.
an astrologer friend of mine and he said, you know, basically from this date to this date, you're going to be in the Saturn cycle, and it's going to be the perfect. It'd be the perfect time for you to buy a house. And literally, I started looking like a month before the Saturn cycle started, which was good because that kind of gave me an idea of what to look for. But literally, the first day that the Saturn cycle started was the day I found my house.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's really
Yeah,
cool. What's your ascendant, by the, what's your rising sign, by the way?
Aquarius.
Or Aquarius? Oh, okay. Okay, so Aquarius, Pisces, Aries, Taurus. Oh, so Taurus is your fourth house. Okay. I was wondering like, does he have Saturn ruling his fourth house or not? But it makes sense you're an Aquarius rising then. That's perfect though. That is a really good example of that. Personally, how I do that, because you know, you can get caught up in trying to do everything way too perfectly, and it's just impossible to do everything perfectly astrologically time-wise, because the thing is that the planets don't stop. Like the planets don't take breaks, they don't take pauses.
I know. What is up with that? They don't ever go to the restroom. They're always just going and going and going and going.
Exactly, and we are subject to their laws through fate. And that's not a bad thing. I think a lot of people hear the word fate and they get really scared, but that's not how I look at it. One way that I time things, I guess, with stuff like that, for instance, would be Mercury retrograde cycles. I tend to make Mercury retrograde, since they happen 3 times a year. They're very frequent compared to other planets' epicycles, and they're not the end of the world. It's a time to take a break, a time to reflect on things. Probably not the best time to launch a new business career, but it's not the end of the world. And so timing your business choices around Mercury stations, as well as things like when to take a break and when to step back and take a quiet mode sort of approach to things, is one way that I would look at something like Mercury retrograde cycles. All the all the planets, all 5 of the classical planets minus the luminaries, have periods where they move backwards apparently in the sky. This is just because of the relationship between them and the sun. And I think they're very misunderstood things, especially because of how they're represented in pop astrology. And so you have lots of people who, and this is the double-edged sword of astrology being popular now, more popular than it's ever been in its entire history,
Mhm.
which is, jaw-dropping in a lot of ways. But if you're like me and you're kind of a, I don't know, I like to call myself principled. Other people will probably just call me stubborn. Uh, but it can get very, very frustrating because people just don't understand the philosophy that underlies these things. Like astrology isn't defined superficially. Like there's not superficial reasons for why planets have certain associations. Astrology is the study of light and causes. For each of us, that original cause is our birth, relatively speaking, obviously. And so that's why we looked at the natal chart for ourselves. You know, you could say, oh, well, the ultimate cause is the birth of the universe. Well, I mean, to be frank, the birth and death of the universe are not events that occur within linear time as we would understand it. They are co-present phases of the universe that exist at the same exact time, which is why we can do magic. That's why sometimes people get confused as to why I practice magic, but also am a fatalist. And the thing is that fate is not exactly what people think it is, especially if you believe, as I do, that beginning and ending is an eternal process. That means that at any point you can choose to consciously work alongside the creative powers of the universe and change the world and change your own fate to a certain extent. And that's a major reason that I study and have continued to study astrology and magic and alchemy, because I think these three together form a key that overall elevates humanity in ways that, you know, are very subtle and not apparent to the immediate understanding of a person.
It's interesting because I think about it like in terms of the cycles of time. Like you have this rhythmic cycle. I mean, we have the turning of the year, for example, and the seasons, and
Yes.
and of course the holidays, if you observe those, and then you have like the moon, the new moon, or the dark moon, and then the full moon, and of course everything in between. And these other aspects that all play a role. And then of course even just kind of like the iterative process of life, where you're kind of like, life is like a spiral where, like, you come to a certain point and you're also connected to that point from before, and then before and before and before. So like when you talk about that, that's another perspective on that, or another angle on that can be really useful, I think, for doing magic. And it's good to step outside of the linear notions of magic and explore it from a non-linear perspective. So I like that. I think that's a really interesting take on it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's taken me a while to get to this point. I feel like possibly I've arrived at it younger than some people do, but it's still, certainly from my perspective, has taken a long time to get there, because when I started, exploring magic, I first and foremost was more fascinated, this as a young age, with magical creatures. And, that's something that still has remained, because I mean, that really is what you're doing when you, for instance, are trying to work with like elemental powers of any kind, or any of the sublunary spirits that exist within this realm. They are creatures in a very literal way. And so that was kind of fed by more of an interest of, does it work? Is this possible? Are these things that exist? Whereas now, oddly, probably enough to my younger self, who was much more obsessed with, and, I still do like, the practicality is good, but also, after burning your fingers a couple times, you kind of want to pull back from the magic that goes boom, uh, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah.
I was very much obsessed with Goetia for a good amount of my early, I guess, magical career path, whatever you want to call it. And that's something that has changed a good amount, and especially as part of why I take this more of this like traditional Hermetic approach to things, where my concern is primarily with myself and my own fate, and rectifying things within my own fate. Also, in a weird way, Hermeticism in this in this way kind of reminds me of Buddhism almost, because kind of the goal is to get out of the cycle of metempsychosis where you possibly might get sent backwards if you haven't been a particularly virtuous person, right? um, I don't think I'd like to come back to Earth. So, ultimately my goals have changed from I want to summon a demon so I can get laid next Saturday to, I want to understand my own deeper spiritual, demonic self so I can get out, not have to come back to planet Earth another time to figure things out.
Well, but I would, and this is not necessarily to contradict you. I mean, I do a fair amount of work with the Goetia even now. In fact, I'm actually doing a thing where we're working with the demon a week. And I think that the thing that I think is often misunderstood about working with demons a lot of times is that, the focus a lot of times is on like material goals, but that's because it comes from a grimoire tradition.
Yeah. True.
But if you step out of the grimoire tradition and step into more of a collaborative relationship with the daemons, what ends up happening is that you find that really they end up holding mirrors to you and showing you the areas of your life that you need to work on and the things that you need to do, because they're not gonna pull any punches with you. They're always going to show you exactly what is going on with you. And even the areas where you lie to yourself, they're not going to lie to you. And so I think, a lot of times it really depends on like, well, what is the reason? Why am I working? Like with any type of spirit, why am I working with these spirits? What is it that I'm trying to go for? I do think that there's something to be said for the fact that everyone goes through a period of time where they do things just for the sake of doing it, because it's like, well, hey, here I am, and I can get laid next week, and why not? Or I can get some money, or I can get, getting those physical results. And I'm going to say, I mean, there's nothing wrong with doing results-based magic. I do results-based magic still sometimes, but I found the need to do it less and less. And it's because I'm continually working on myself, like as you are. And I think it's interesting because, with the laboratory alchemy work, I mean, isn't that one of the goals, that when you're creating this process, you're actually doing this internal work on yourself. And it's not even so much about the finished product as it is about the journey toward that process.
Yes, 100%. That's everything I could put into a spiel about it. But yeah, no, that is exactly the point. And I think that's why alchemy has become more of a focus for me and will probably remain a focus, because it gives me, in a way, these things that are goal set. So they still are material to a certain point, practical to a certain point. But the other part of it is that exactly when anything you do in the lab, anything you subject another piece of matter to, you are also going through it yourself. And furthermore, when you consume that medicine, it continues to do the work that you put it through on you internally, because what you're really doing with alchemical medicines like spagyric tinctures or elixirs, plant stones, things like that, is that you are creating an equilibrium internally amongst your own stars, because that's the thing about the natal chart, is that it exists within us. When you look at that circle with all those planets in it, that's it's an image of this sky at the moment you were born, right? And the eastern and western horizons and things that are under the horizon at the time. But more importantly, what it really is a two-dimensional image of a four-dimensional object. That object is you, and you exist between 2 points in time, your birth and your death. And everything that happens in that life is contained within the birth chart because it's eternal. And integrating alchemy into your practice will help you, I feel like, become more grounded in in your understanding of your natal chart. That's what I have found for myself anyways. I feel that it's a very good thing to combine with, things that are results based. I mean, these talismans that, like, I love showing off my ring, but I'm also wearing a Jupiter talisman that I made last summer, right before he was retrograde. Might not have been the best timing because he was slowing down, but he had just entered Pisces. And so, I always figure planets are very happy and joyful the moment they get in the door. And it's like, why do you do that? Why make that talisman as our point to it? And it's like, well, success, right? That's still a practical goal-based, result-based thing. But at the same time, there's a flip side to it in that Jupiter is the Lord of my ascendant. I'm a Sag rising. So he is very intimately tied to who I am. So by working with Jupiterian energies, I'm really bringing a balance to myself because I'm going back to the root. That's why I named my business Rooted Stars Astrology, because it's all about nourishing those roots to be able to grow. When in the practice of horary astrology, where you answer questions, in a similar way to drawing cards at random, you throw a chart for the moment that the astrologer understands the question. And before you do that, you have to judge whether or not the chart is radical. And radical meaning, does it have root in reality at that moment? Because that's the most critical part of all of this, is making sure that it is actually rooted in reality. And so what I found is that through talismanic magic, and now through combining that with alchemical medicine, I am nourishing those things and making my life more holistic, I suppose. I feel like I'm using a lot of these same words over and over again, but I feel like it's just because the answers are sort of simple in that way. Like I also am not a fan of just inventing new things to invent new things. I like what I do because they are traditions, and traditions exist for a reason.
Sure.
And they will.
And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, it's good to know and to be able to draw upon the history of what has come before in order to move forward.
Yeah, precisely. So, I don't really, I'm unbothered by the fact that it's like I focus on providing answers to questions humans have asked for a long time. And I don't need to reinvent the wheel with that. In fact, I just have to learn how to read the wheel, so to speak. And that is where I'm very happy to be. Excuse me. Oh gosh, I feel like I'm getting lost in words right now. Yeah.
It's okay, but the important thing is, I think that, like, as you say, there's this the fundamental balancing really of the work that you're doing. And so, like, there isn't a need to come up with new terms in order to describe the work. The need is really evident. And I think it's interesting, like you said, you did this talisman for the Jupiter when it was slowing down. But I mean, the thing I think that's worth noting is too that there is something to be said for knowing when to work with something and when it best aligns with you. And that may not be at the most obvious, like what someone else would say, well, it should be at this time or that time. Well, maybe not. I mean, I think it really boils down to like what, based on your own self-awareness and knowledge, as well as the currents that you're working with, like figuring out the best time for you. That may not be exactly may not be what would be considered the optimum, but it is optimum for you. I mean, there is very much, I think, a sense of personalization that occurs with magical work. And a lot of times when we have these principles where it's kind of like a catch-all, we have to recognize, well, there's some truth to that, but there's also truth to when and where it personally relates to me and the work that I'm doing and how that's going to help me move that work forward.
Yeah, I think that is a good point. That is very true. And like I said, with especially astrological magic of any kind, it's very hard not to get hung up on trying to be, a perfectionist, like exact day and hour plus planet in an opportune sign or place, like possibly within its own bounds or maybe within its own decan in a specific sign, and so on. Lots of things like that. It's all, like nesting dolls, like those little Russian nesting dolls, just one after another after another after another inside. And another thing with that too is that, what the planets, what they go through during their retrogrades is a perfectly natural thing. So while it might be seen as being detrimental in some aspects, there's also something to it that I think is deeply tied to the natural processes that are going on that at their core are also alchemical. Because how I see it, the cosmos, speaking in terms of, a Terra-centric astrological model, in a classical model. I don't use the outer planets in case anybody's might be wondering why I haven't mentioned any of them. I don't use them. But their cyanotic cycles are perfectly normal. And what they do is they illustrate everything constantly working towards perfection. The heavens are unchanging, but they are also showing us the work in this extremely extravagant, long-term, unending, cycle upon cycle, getting lost here. Sometimes I feel like I get distracted because I might not want to say everything. But that is something I did want to bring up about where astrology and alchemy really intersect, is because alchemy is kind of a key to both understanding astrology and what it really is, and also magic and what it really is. Because the key that we're looking for here is transmutation. We're trying to change things, right?
Sure, right.
And that can take many different meanings. It doesn't necessarily mean lead into gold, though certainly some people have achieved that. One of my favorite stories Robert told us in class one time was about how the Romans, when they began outlawing texts on alchemy, it was because Egypt, which was a Roman colony at the time, kept rebelling, successfully raising up armies to rebel. And it was because they were able to afford buying mercenaries with gold that was produced alchemically. And so Rome decided, okay, enough is enough. And they send out centurions across, all over the place. And do you really think a centurion is going to know what an alchemical text looks like? No. So really what they did was just go around and round up any text that looks vaguely, possibly magical or informative on the topic, and then burned it. And I always thought that was funny, that Egypt was just such a little rebel that way. And I mean, supposedly that is where alchemy comes from. So it doesn't surprise me that up until the Roman period, it was still something that was, practiced there and known and understood to be a real thing. But there is something going back to the point of what I was saying, where I was talking about how alchemy is a key to understanding the other Hermetic arts, because it demonstrates the ability to transmute things. In, I think it's book 1 of Picatrix, there is a quote that I almost completely have memorized, I guess, but the gist of it is that they describe magic, or the art of making talismans, as being the work of spirit upon spirit, or spirit upon body. And then alchemy as the work of body upon body. And they don't say this, but that kind of insinuates that then astrology would be the work of soul upon body, or soul upon soul. And I like to think of it as like soul upon soul, spirit upon spirit, body upon body. And working with these 3 things together is what's going to give us the ability to actually cause that transmutation for ourselves internally in a very spiritual way. This is by using out, spagyrics that we produce, or other medicines or elixirs that we produce to be conducive to the facts of our natal chart. And so we look to those medicines to transmute our body. We look to them, the talismans and the magic that we do, to change our spirit, so to speak, to uplift it, and to change its circumstances. And we look at our natal chart, because it's the imprinting of soul upon soul. That's the moment, that's the image of the moment that we're born, right? That's the image of our soul entering our body. And so I think of that as being like the universal soul stamping our own individual soul onto our body at that moment. And understanding these three things together in that way, you know, it's a newer thing for me to realize that, oh, maybe working with all three is the key to doing some rather powerful things.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think I'm losing my
Well, I was going to say, I mean, I think that this is a good place for us. That's a great place to bring this to a wrap. I mean, this is a really good realization, very profound. Um, so if you could share again where we can find you online, and then any final thoughts you have for us, I'd appreciate it.
yeah. Um, so if you're interested in finding me online, you can find me at rootedstarastrology.com. You can also find me on Instagram. My tag is at rootedstarastrology. I don't have a Facebook page for this because Facebook has been getting gradually more annoying with making pages for things, or at least I found it to be so. So you can find me on Instagram or my own website. I also have a Patreon for people who are interested in supporting my work. I share unique articles on astrology and alchemy there. So that's a really good reason to go over to Patreon and find me. And that's going to be just patreon.com/rootedstarastrology again. And I will say that, you know, my lowest tier still gets access to like all of my articles as well. So it is a good way of helping support me that way, especially because I would like to begin offering courses on Hermetic philosophy and the Hermetic arts in general soon, and producing that will take support. Final thoughts. Well, I really hope that people have found something useful in all of the things I've said. Hopefully there have been some sort of mysteries communicated, quite possibly. And I would really, really encourage people to explore, always explore who they are. That might sound kind of woo-woo, but I mean that in the sense of, you know, like, come to understand who you are astrologically. You know, seek that out, know thyself. There's nothing that's going to explain you better truly than the natal chart. And always try to keep an open mind that maybe some things that you think you see in there aren't the things that you think they're going to be. And I would really hope as well that if anybody is particularly interested in seeing how I do astrology with my clients, that they would go and visit my site and possibly book me. I really have the goal of helping others achieve a holistic magical practice combining the arts of astrology, alchemy, and magic. And I would really hope that I can help expose people to these practices.
All right. Well, thank you very much for coming on the show. It's been wonderful to have you here. And I hope that, you know, people will check your site out.
Thank you. It was really great to be here. Enjoyed it.